So, did you really think that?
I knew it. I knew you were going to.
You knew I was gonna. Okay, that's good. You predicted well. So you're getting to know your professor. That's pretty good. All right, let's take a look at the Moodle really quickly, and then just jump into today because I really need most of today to talk about Don Quixote. Which, if you have opinions on Don Quixote, be prepared to share them. Cervantes is an extremely funny author. A couple of things you should know about him. I'm going to tell you, but I'm not going to tell you quite yet. But he was missing part of his hand, was once enslaved after working on a ship as something like a mercenary, and was never really famous. There were much more famous literateurs during his life, in particular, the great Golden Age Spanish playwright Lope de Vega, who wrote something like between 700 and 1,000 plays. Which, I mean, think about making 700 to 1,000 journal entries. It's quite a bit of output. Imagine how good you would get at something after having written so many plays. And you say, well, what if you're just reduplicating the error? Wouldn't you just get entrenched in your bad habits? I'd say, if you didn't have a public, because the thing about having a public or having a certain contingent of people that wish to buy your product is that their tastes will dictate what you make to some extent. So if you continue successfully to make plays and people continue to consume those plays, he was making the necessary adjustments. All right, so the Moodle now has our first lecture on it, a little piece on the Republic of Letters. I think it's a really cool little piece to check out because it will talk to you a little bit about what we're trying to do in this class and also lay a little bit of Latin on you, res publica literarum. And the reason we want to include a little bit of Latin, a little bit of Greek, is because, and I learned this in college, it's the mark of a sophisticated intellect to have forgotten a little bit of Greek and Latin. And so I invite you to learn this so that you may forget it, so that you too may be sophisticated in such ways. That said, I have a couple other short pieces that I include. Daniel Mendelsohn, he is one of these classicists that I mentioned. He is one of the elite classicists, teaches, I believe, in New York, and a constant, he's transcended his role as a scholar and is now also a popular writer, wrote a book on the relationship between him and his father reading the Odyssey together. And also, he makes some interesting claims. How many of you have majors that are like practical, accounting, science? You're going to get a job after college, and you came to college to get a job. Okay. How many of you came to college to explore ideas and to perhaps just personally you put your hands up proudly? There's a reason to come to university. Yeah. Daniel Mendelsohn, especially being a classicist and from the humanities, occupies that sort of perspective. He sees the great value of an education as being able to open your mind to new ideas, to transform your personality, which is, there is nothing more important to making you the person that you are than your education. No demographic data about you is important as what you fill your mind with. And this is something all teachers, all coaches, all must believe in order to be in this profession. But Daniel Mendelsohn will say some interesting things, and I highly recommend that you read this because you may react very positively to it. Again, if you're on the one side of the fence, you may react negatively to it. He'll make a claim that your accounting degree, and I highly encourage you to get an accounting degree. Money is very important, especially if you've taken out loans for your education. You'll want to pay those back ASAP. Money is a big deal. And even if it is not the most important thing in one's life, it does matter. That said, Mendelsohn will encourage you to think about how, well, accounting may help you on the day-to-day, but if, say, somebody very close to you, like your father or parent, dies out of nowhere, are you going to be mentally capable, ready, prepared to deal with such an eventuality? And if you really think about it, and this is a macabre thought, and this is a sad thought, but this is a real thought, probably things like that are going to happen to all of you multiple times. Not necessarily tomorrow, but unexpected tragedies will occur on a national scale, on a community scale, on a personal level. And so his claim about works like what we're reading, even though it is so funny right now, is that they prepare you for emotional, trying, difficult moments in your own lives. That what good drama does is it shows people in conflict And it shows them effectively dealing with that conflict in a way that allows you to mirror this action in an analogous situation. So it may not be the case that, like Cervantes, you're taken as a slave after losing part of your hand to a cannonball, and then have to eventually be. He didn't escape; he was bought back by, I believe it was his family. I can't imagine it would be anybody else. But you may yourself, and I'm sure that you will face your own challenges. And my hope, teaching a course like this, is that the literature helps you to transform into the sort of person that can deal with what life throws at you. And that is, in general, besides teaching you to write and to just think for yourself, the value of a good humanities course. So you're not necessarily going to have the skill necessary to balance your checkbook by the end of this, but you might have the sort of fortitude or perspective necessary to deal with the worst day of your life, whenever it comes. And, I repeat The Simpsons on this. Bart, was that any of you Simpsons fans? Oh, wow, this is dating. Any of you some sort of animated show fan? How many of you watch anime, by the way? Here's a big cultural shift. And the fact that everybody says that. When I watched it or listened to EDM when I was a little bit younger, people were like, nerd. Nowadays, standard, have to know dubstep and things like that. But Bart goes to Homer, his dad, is this sort of everyman who says, Dad, this has been the worst day of my life. Do any of you know what his father says back to him? Pats him on the shoulder and he says, the worst day of your life so far, son. The worst day of your life so far. And that's, well, I don't wish to depress anybody, but it is certainly the case that the worst day of your life so far will someday be superseded by another sort of day. Another little piece. These are very short pieces I've put on the Moodle, again, so that you can just sort of read about the course. A classics professor, I believe from Dartmouth, which is one of our Ivy Leagues, one of the lesser known Ivy Leagues, classics professor reads great literature with veterans. Something that apparently helps people who have combat experiences to sit in circles like we will be doing in about a week and a half and to talk over some of these major ideas. There seems to be some sort of therapeutic effect that these people experience, these combat veterans experience when they talk about texts like the Iliad, which features a war and the sort of loss that happens with the war. In particular, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but there are some major, like Game of Thrones, there are some major deaths of major characters that one comes to care about over quite a bit of time. And especially with the Iliad, it takes so much effort to learn to read it, to put the effort to read it. And then once you can read it and understand it, to have someone that you've come to know fall out from that world and to see others in that world be pained by it, it's painful. And I think it is very much reminiscent of the sort of experience of a combat veteran who lost a member of his, usually his, but his or her team has experienced. And not just combat veterans either. Again, everybody deals with loss. And so part of what we attempt to teach you in the humanities is how to deal with loss by giving you something in addition to it. Also, there's an alternative translation of Don Quixote here. I give this a little trepidation because it's got some additional sort of Cliff Notes things involved, but really I like to give this because of the art. Take a look at all this stuff. I know, it may not seem like the best ever, but almost every chapter has a little bit of art involved in it. And again, not to denigrate you, but visual arts, we are a visual creature, really help you to sort of understand and to inform your imagination while you're reading these things. Now, but again, don't feel compelled to imagine what you see, because this is itself a representation from the imagination of another reader of this text. Have any of you ever read a book like Harry Potter, then watched the movie and been very much upset by the representation of one of your characters? Of course, because they don't look right, and sometimes they don't look right. I'll tell you, Final Fantasy VII, I grew up playing that game. The main antagonist is named Sephiroth. He has green eyes. Multiple times it's mentioned he has green eyes. Current representations of him, blue eyes. Blue eyes. One understands why one makes it that. The whole idea is that he's strange. Green eyes are the rarest eye color. that we have. Hazel, what I have, a lot of people say brown, second rarest. Blue, after that, but green is supposed to have a connotation, not only of pretty, but rare, strange. And the whole notion of the character is that he is rare and strange. So adapting this character, they have taken away from what makes him what he is. And, I encourage you to be sensitive to such issues like that, because you are probably reacting to a diminution of the character's representation when you dislike it for some reason. I'll also just tell you something personally. Harry Potter 1 and 2, I thought they nailed it with Dumbledore. Unfortunately, he died. The Dumbledore after that, terrible. He didn't even read the books too, by the way. Yeah, I know. You would think that would be a requirement, but no, apparently not. All right. I told you that I had the paper and rubrics here, and I'm going to open them and look at them, and that's it. We're going to talk about them on Wednesday. I encourage you, however, to open that yourself. Take a look at the rubric. Look very closely at the rubric, every word. Look very closely at the prompts and start to make a decision about which prompt resonates with you most. Maybe start even to outline. I will talk a lot more about this on Wednesday, but we need a little bit of course content before we start talking about everything. This little paper, this so-called, okay, there we go. The standard MLA paper, read through this. We write in MLA format in this course. The worst thing you can do to yourself is to not familiarize yourself with the style sheet, to write an essay, and then try and apply the formatting at the end when you're tired and it's 3 a.m. and you need to be very present. The technical work of an essay is brutal. Nobody loves it. I'm a writer. I have multiple published essays. The technical work that goes into work of published scholarship is tremendous. I mean, even the metadata that you don't see, all the comments that are made by the reviewers that need to be addressed and resolved, it takes a lot of work. That said, this is not there yet, but is a good start. So knowing that you have a heading, and the heading has to be perfect. Knowing that you need a descriptive title, and knowing how much it needs to be spaced from your first paragraph, knowing that your first paragraph needs to be indented, knowing that you need what is called a running head with your name, space, and a number, and that the running head, which is not natural, needs to be in the same font as your body paragraphs. We'll talk a lot more about that. Not a lot more about that. We'll talk more about that as we go. But there are a lot of little things that you need to familiarize yourself with. So I highly recommend take a look through this, maybe a quick look at first just to see how things are. Maybe you'll notice something new, like, oh, there's some notes. I don't expect you to have notes. Oh, okay, it doesn't say references or bibliography, it says works cited. And we'll talk a little bit about how philosophically works cited are different from a bibliography. Any of you have ideas from the get-go about the difference between that? Have you spent a lot of time thinking about the differences between bibliographies and works cited? Well, bibliography, just to give you a quick premise, or précis, I guess I should say, is everything that you possibly inspired your knowledge in a work, anything you derived influence from. Whereas works cited is what works cited are works that you explicitly cite in the text. And so it's much more straightforward, a little bit less philosophical. Okay, so all these things are up here. I would like for you to familiarize yourself with each of them. Remember that we're not in class on Monday. I'm sure you know much better than I do. But that's that. Any questions about what we've talked about so far before we get into the meat or the, I can't believe it's not meat of the course if you happen to be vegan. All right, let's jump into Don Quixote itself. I believe I have some things to say to you about it. There are a couple facts at the end of the very first slides that you may want to familiarize yourself with, but when I looked through them, I thought that I saw a lot of duplication between those and here. This says chapters 1 to 23 of part 1. We're going to go over chapters 1 through 8 today, which is part 1 of part 1. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Cervantes, the structure of the work, which is very important. Something to start getting you into the modernist frame of mind is that Several of the works we read are complicated in ways that go beyond their verse or syntax. They're complicated in ways that transcend their plot or the characterization or the language, the diction, which is used. They're complicated structurally. Many of these texts are split into two, and many of these two-part texts were written at one time and then separated by a huge gulf of time. So it's almost as if the author who wrote the second part was a totally different person, or at least a very different person from the first part. What do I mean? Cervantes first wrote part one of Don Quixote, which was supposed to be a standalone novel in 1605. He would only return to it 10 years later after a pseudonymous character named Avellaneda wrote a spurious Don Quixote. He became so enraged at the fact that another author would take his creation and do something with it that he wrote in furiously fast. I think he wrote the vast majority of the second part, which is longer than the first part by some bit, in 18 months. He wrote it so fast so that he could, part of what he does is to make fun of Avellaneda, but he also takes back control of his character by, well, what do you think the best way to put into people telling stories about your character is? What should you do to the character at the end of the story? Right? Gotta kill him. Gotta kill him. And so this may be a snuff tale. You all know that expression, like not snuff as in like, the tobacco product, but to snuff one out. And so watch out for Don Quixote. You may come to love somebody that is doomed to die, perhaps everybody that you love. In any case, Don Quixote's relevant publication information, and even the title itself, I think when you look at it, how many of you have studied some Spanish, like a little Spanish, not a ton of Spanish? Quixote. Quixote. What is wrong with the spelling of this word? And in fact, if you ever read Spanish publications about Quixote, you will see it spelled differently because of conventions of modern Spanish. What is it? The X. What should be there? What makes the ha sound? And ha ha ha, you often see in the J, right? And the Spanish spelling is J. Why the X? Is there any place you may know of that maybe isn't in the United States or near that has an X in the middle of its name? That yes, Osaka. Oh yeah. But even the second place. Have you ever heard Mexico called Mexico? It was originally called. What is it? So this tells you that. And have you heard of a place called Tejas, often called Texas? These are Spanish names. These are old Spanish names. The X originally made the sound, the H sound. So Don Quixote is a traditional spelling from 17th century Spanish, which is often updated to the J. So when you see Don Quixote with a J, it's either modern Spanish scholarship or a modern Spanish just philosophical spell, or how should I don't, or the translator that has given you the work has decided to modernize all of the names as well. But you see a vestige of the past even in the name. I think I have more to say about this too, but let's just keep looking at Don Quixote. Don, what does that tell you about this character? It comes from the Latin Dominus. Dominus means master, Lord. What does Don tell you about this character, supposedly? He's important, a little bit more concrete, I need. A leader, okay, but we're such Americans that we don't really think like this, but he's noble. This is a society that knows social rank. Now you can definitely make the claim that we have social rank, and we certainly have economic rank in the United States. There are different tax brackets, for example, that one falls into. But we don't necessarily have indications in our name that we have a higher status and more legal rights than additional people. In fact, I met a count in Austria this year, and when he was talking about being a count, everybody's like, wow, count, they're taking pictures of him. There's some like 18 counts left in Austria, and he's like, yes, well, being a count, now we have We have great land and many counties. This is where county comes from. Counties are no longer ruled by counts, but unfortunately, we do not have extra rights anymore. And I as an American, was like, yes, unfortunate. But so Don suggests that this is a noble. In Spanish, by the way, often if somebody is named something like Lope de Vega means from a certain place. It's like von in German, so I'm just going to put this everywhere, or van in Dutch. To be of a place is to have ownership over a place. And so Don suggests that he is a noble. Something that you will have noted about him is that his name is not actually Don Quixote, this character. He calls himself Don Quixote. His name is Alonso Quijada or Quijana. The narrator tells us that he doesn't even know. And he comes from somewhere near De La Mancha that he doesn't even want to remember. And so two things about that are that names are obviously extremely important in this text. Who gets to define whether you are Don Quixote or Alonso Quijada? This is a major problem in our culture too right now. People can redefine themselves, and yet social expectations seem to keep people from entirely doing this. This text could not be more about that particular issue, because this man decides that he is going to live inside of a totally different story, as a totally different character from anyone who has ever existed, and it causes massive problems with everybody he meets. Because you don't know what to expect from such a man, because you think such a man is crazy. And yet, I want to ask you a question. Now, I, of course, admit that the standard definition of insanity seems like a good one. To be, what is it that we say in the DSM for text revision now? It's something like to be so different or strange as to, and this is not perfect because I haven't read this in a while and I'm not a psychology professor, but as to have your behavior and thoughts make you maladaptive to your current situation. So if the things you believe are making you impoverished, making you sick, perhaps hurting the people around you, that is evidence of insanity. There's a problem with that definition, though. What is it? Is insanity a consistent thing throughout cultures and time? If insanity is defined by you as an individual being maladaptive to your society, is what makes somebody insane or maladaptive something that is itself mutable and can change? And so when we look at Don Quixote and we laugh at him for his insanity, and he's called insane by the narrator and everybody that meets him in the get-go, we assume he's insane. He's not going to be picked up by the Holy Brotherhood, which is like kind of the cops that go around Spain at that time and serve the king, because he's crazy. He lost his wits from too much reading because so this guy is defined as crazy. But who's to say? Who is to say that Don Quixote, Alonso Quijada, is the one that is off base rather than his society? I think at the very get-go, all we can really say is that society, at least within the context of this book, there are more individuals who believe differently from Don Quixote. And because of that, his way of acting trespasses on the beliefs and the mores of those around him. And yet, does that mean that he is wrong? He is in the extreme minority, only he acts in the way that he does. But how can we determine that he is the wrong one and everybody that he meets in these pages are the right ones about how they perceive reality?
Philosophy.
It is certainly a philosophical argument and certainly uses reasoning in the way of philosophy, but just because an argument is a perennial argument doesn't mean that I give up on it. It means that I wish to add to it. But these are the sorts of questions that I wish for you to really grapple with in this class, particularly if you're somebody that really wants to conform to a certain profession or notion, or if you're somebody who really wants to react against conforming, if you're a countercultural sort of individual. These are questions that you may want to ask. Why is it that I resist this way of doing things that many other people do? Or why is it that everybody does this thing that seems, not the best? In any case, that's a big question for the first bullet point on the PowerPoint. Miguel de Cervantes, and you see that duh in his name. He's basically middle class though. He was born 29 September 1549 in Alcalá de Henares, Spain. He published this work, the first part of it, which he intended only to be one part, which is very important, especially if you're thinking about modernism and writing about modernism on your first essay. It was contemporaneous with Shakespeare's late work, like Macbeth, also a very interesting work, first work by Shakespeare performed at night for a king in private. The second part was published in 1615 in response to Fernandez of Avellanedas. Again, that's a pseudonym. Do any of you know what a nom de plume or a pseudonym is? Or what is a pseudonym?
I don't know. It's like a name that you can also go.
That's super close. I can see that you've got the.
I know what it means.
I get that. You'll see me forget words all the time. Pseudo, false, nem, name. False name. Pseudonym is when you write under a name different from yourself. J.K. Rowling didn't really do this, but in order not to be seen as a female when she first wrote, I know she's gotten into hot water lately, she abbreviated her name as J.K. So that, like J.R.R. Tolkien or Martin. What are the first initials of Martin? They're similar to J.R.R. Aren't they? Like G.R.R. George R.R. Martin, right? Exactly. And so you can see that we're supposed to see great fantasy authors when we see abbreviations in the beginning. And you even see this in the names that actors choose for themselves. You'll see names repeat. Okay. So the second part was published in 1615. It was a response to Fernandez de Avellanedas, second book of the ingenious knight Don Quixote. Cervantes himself died the same date. This is a very interesting fact, though not the same day as Shakespeare. Shakespeare died on 23 April. This is weird. 23 April 1616. I'm getting these things wrong. Yes, 1616. But Spain and England were on different calendars at that time. So probably they did not die on the same day, close to the same day, but they did die on the same day. And 23 April actually happens to be the day that my wife was born. So it's very easy for me to remember when Cervantes and Shakespeare died. What's in a name? All right, we talked a little bit about this, so I'm just going to say it again to sort of reiterate the fact. The name, the narrator does not care to remember of the town. We don't really know where this text is taking place. It's general, it's vague. There's something modern or modernist about this. There is power in names, whether you're using a fictional place or a real place. If I say if I say the plot is based in Rome, immediate connotations. If I say it's based in Avalon or the court of King Arthur, immediate connotations. If I say it's some small little podunk town that I don't even care to remember, this is a very different convention. You're a reader. You want to read perhaps a chivalric romance about knights and ladies, magicians, great deeds, named swords. And then you're hearing about a nameless city with a crazy man who's not only crazy, but what's something else? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some differences between Don Quixote and and what we consider a conventional protagonist. So I'll add one. He's crazy. So luckily we have a narrator, so we may or may not have to worry about the problem of the untrustworthy narrator. Are you all aware of that problem in literature, video games, movies, where you have a reality portrayed to you, but near the middle or near the end, turns out that the way things have been portrayed to you has been skewed and you have not seen the full picture. And so your idea of things has been wrong the entire time. Perhaps you thought the bad guy was actually the good guy. It's actually, or vice versa. Something huge changes. What else is different about him? There are a couple things, a couple major things. Think about protagonists. Think about yourselves.
He doesn't really seem like a protagonist. He just seems like a guy riding around his horse because of the things he did, but not really of what a protagonist would normally do.
And think of protagonist, it comes from protos, agon, which means first actor. So protagonist is sort of neutral, but hero doesn't seem like much of a hero or much of a knight. Has a sort of a fake helmet, a blank shield, has to be knighted by an innkeeper who has to tell him that he needs to carry money and clean clothes, but he had never read about a knight carrying money or clean clothes, so he doesn't do it when he first goes out on his first sally. It's very interesting. It tells you something about literary interpretation, how much is left to your own assumptions and expectations, how little actually comes from the text itself, and how much you have to fill in. I think actually personally that that's part of why some people like reading and some people don't. The more imaginative someone is, the more they can do with a middling piece of literature. The less imaginative one is, the more it's just like this weird book that people hallucinate, you know, this weird piece of paper, this weird piece of former wood that people look at in order to hallucinate. That is what reading is, right? Unless you're taking in information, which gets a little bit different. Yes?
Have you read any other like knight books?
Oh man, tons of them. Tons of them, lots of Arthurian romances from the Middle Ages. And I was in fact going to talk a little bit about some of the conventions from that, but something I'll tell you about knightly romances is that a knight takes on a quest, often does have a beloved lady who's cruel to him, who gives him some sort of quest that's magical, like you must within 30 days do whatever it is that you need to do. And if you come back even a minute late, I will never marry you and you'll have to go on a different quest or something. Or Lancelot is very famous for having been told to get into a cart on the behalf of Guinevere, who was his king's wife, but whom he was amorously inclined towards. Guinevere very famously cheats on King Arthur with his greatest knight, Lancelot du Lac, and Lancelot has to get into this cart like a prisoner and ride around in the cart. And it turns out that Guinevere is angry at him because he pauses before he gets into the cart. And so these chivalric romances are themselves sort of ridiculous. And one does run into dwarves, giants, and magic around every corner. It is very much like a video game where one walks for 2 minutes, something happens. And I think you see that when you first read Don Quixote, because he just goes out thinking things are going to happen. And they don't really. But they do, because it is still a narrative itself. And so I think that puts us in an interesting place. But back to what's weird about him. Look at all of you. What's something you all share in common? Students, yes, yes. Demographic data. Young. Most protagonists are young. Most knightly protagonists, and also I'll talk about pastoral works, are like your age, probably actually younger. And I'll make a claim to you right now. Probably most literature, movies, and TV you watch has young protagonists who are premarital. Probably part of the drama is finding the person whom they wish to marry. And this makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, so what is the big accomplishment of being young? Isn't one of the greatest, I think nowadays we'd say attaining a career, but isn't it finding one's soulmate or one's long-term partner? Isn't that, or is it clearly still very important to people who watch and read media to find that other half? In any case, most protagonists are young. Most protagonists are not yet married, though sometimes they are. And especially nowadays, we have all sorts of literature and movies. In fact, there's a movie I really like with Adam Driver about divorce. It's a really hard movie to watch. I think it's called Divorce. I think Scarlett Johansson is also the lead with him. They're getting into fights all the time. It's really hard to watch. Like you watch it and you're like, oh, not pleasant. But some art is good because it can do that. We're not always looking to feel pleasant emotions when we take in media, right? You watch a tragedy not to feel good, but to feel bad. And that might make you feel good too, interestingly enough. But yes, this is a crazy, deluded old man who changes his name and identity. And it's as if he changes the sort of story in which he exists in order to be a character that has never truly existed in the story. Which is to say, in his reality, knights have never existed. In our reality, knights have existed, but not in the same way as they're portrayed in, say, EverQuest or World of Warcraft, or even in knightly romances about King Arthur. In fact, there are a lot of sort of negative facts we know about knights now, that they would sort of have a tower and they would terrorize the countryside if there wasn't a greater lord around them. In particular, picking up peasant women and murdering peasant men. That was behavior that had to be reined in by more powerful lords. And so the idea of knights being chivalric and being very genteel in their manners and observing these highfalutin customs is to some extent more mythology than it is history. I mean, when you think of a knight, do you think of a murderous, rapine individual, or do you think of like some extremely blonde, noble individual with like foot on a serpent, that like images of St. George and the dragon? Right. Those are a bit propagandist. In any case, the many names of Don Quixote. Something I didn't say about his name is the ote end is a suffix that is a negative suffix. It would be like, I don't know. You all know internet language. You know what it means to call something mid at these days. It would be a little bit worse than that. So ote is a negative pejorative. Pejorative means it takes away from the name. Ito is one that a lot of people know. It makes something smaller, but ote means that he's a little bit worse. So his name is itself a strange combination of elite, but also negative. Something added, but something taken away too. There's an irony to the name that he chooses for himself. If you really wanted to make yourself look good, you would call yourself Commander Super Blaster or something like that, or Commander Lion Face Heart. You know, you would choose to try and build yourself up, right? You wouldn't say Commander Rat Face. But this is a little bit more like what this is. It's like, oh, you're Commander, but you're Rat Face. Is that good? And that is the sort of feeling you should inhabit when you look at Don Quixote. Is that right? Is that good? Is that right? Is that true? One should have these feelings. In fact, if you are having these feelings, you are reading this text correctly. If you think you have a good beat on what's going on, just keep reading, because things change fast. All right, so he calls himself Don Quixote, but apparently he does have some name, though we do not get what the actual name is until the very last pages of part 2, by the way. But maybe he's Quijada, maybe he's Quejada, maybe he's Quejana, maybe he's Alonso Quijano the Good. That comes from the end. But this is interesting because it's almost as if signifiers of names, we say that they're so important. We say that identity is important. And apparently identity is important to him because he re-identifies himself. And yet the narrator subverts this idea by not even telling us what his real name is, as if his real name is not important, as if this character we're dealing with is in fact only the character we're dealing with and not the person that he was before. It's as if this story is in fact about Don Quixote, not about Alonso Quijano the Good. And this is an idea that continues to be reiterated in our own culture. In fact, there was a Don Quixote that came out something like 5 years ago, again with Adam Driver. And just to let you know, this is not my personal preference. If you read the Edith Grossman introduction, which we're certainly not required to do, something like, what is it? It was 54 contemporary authors made a list of 100 of the greatest books ever to have existed, and they put Don Quixote as number. And so we'll see the definition and redefinitions of objects like windmills. We saw that in chapter 8 for the reading here. This is if you were to read chapters 1 through 8, you would have the idea most people have of Don Quixote. He redefines his name, he goes around and makes some mischief happen. He goes to an inn, thinks it's a council, sees 2 prostitutes, thinks they're ladies, doesn't pay the innkeeper then knights him. He goes out and finds this poor servant being beaten terribly by his master Juan el Dudo. We will see Andreas again, by the way, and he will have been beaten even worse by Juan el Dudo. And we also see an interaction with some clerics. And then we see, and I think I'm going quickly because I'm starting to run out of time, we see Don Quixote return home where two major characters are met, the barber and the cleric. And what is it that they decide to do alongside the two women in Don Quixote's life? Burn all of his books, of course, because they are the source of his insanity. Not only do they burn all of his books, not quite all of his books, though.
Yeah, they're like, this is my friend, he's my friend, I know that guy.
Well, and did you, so Amadis of de Gaul is the base text, the source text of this text. And you'll hear about Amadis de Gaul and his great love, Oriana, over, ad infinitum, ad nauseum, which is a great Latin phrase that means until you vomit. Because you'd be so full of it, right? But did you notice that also there was a work called La Galatea that made it? And did you see who the author of La Galatea was? One of Cervantes' books, La Galatea, makes the cut. And so he includes his own work and a sort of meta commentary on the value of his work. All these other works poison the mind. And I want you to think about that from a sort of censorship perspective. And this is something I'm really going to hit harder next time, but something strange that has happened by 1605 is that religious and civic authorities have lost control of national narratives. What do I mean? Well, the printing press came around in 1453, which allowed the dissemination of more information than had ever existed. All of a sudden, lots of books could exist. It was like the internet coming around. All of a sudden, you could access all this information. You didn't need scholars. You might need scholars to know what's real and what's not, but you can access a lot more information now than you ever have been able to. 1517 to 1521, the Protestant Reformation happens. What does that mean? That means that the Christian religion that had been a unified whole, basically, except for since the Eastern-Western divide, split again due to the actions of Martin Luther. His 95 Theses that he put up on Halloween, by the way. So if you want to make that 95 Theses Day, make it such. With the split of the religion and the coming of the printing press, many new ideas proliferated about into society. And new sorts of writers came about, writers of fiction. So people didn't just listen to liturgies on Christian notions in Spain at this time. People could now read for pleasure, read for fun. And I want you to think about your own habits of reading and listening and watching. Do you agree with the priest and the barber and Don Quixote's a niece and I believe a maid? I'll make sure on that, but I believe that it's servant and his niece. Do you agree that the literature and the media that you put inside of yourself can poison you, can drive you crazy? In fact, people are nodding at this. It's great. People on the internet, let it be noted that people are nodding at this. So you take that seriously, that what you put in here can affect what you see and can be negative or positive. You better be careful reading this book with this crazy man then, because I'll tell you, my first forum last year, one of the first questions one of the students asked me, especially because, I'm a literary professor, I'm not like a chemistry professor where it makes a lot of sense. He was like, Professor Schmidt, do you think you're like Don Quixote and have gone crazy? Because you've read all of these books? And I had a funny response for him, but we're going to have to save that for next time because it's almost time to go, and that means it's time to go. All right. I will see you all on Wednesday. I know I didn't get all the way through the lecture. That said, I will have more time to get through it.